I'm very conscious as I sit here in a safe country in the EU that there is suffering, panic, and fear within the trans community, and especially lesbian, white, and wider LGBTQ people, but also very many others. So I'm going to speak simply and directly and inclusively, I hope, today, because my audience is all people and not just trans people. The United Nations Commissioner for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, in his report last year, after investigating the United Kingdom, said that he was, and I quote, deeply concerned about increased bias-motivated incidents of harassment, threats, and violence against LGBT people, including a rampant surge in hate crimes in the UK. A well-funded campaign has created an impression which mainstream people have sometimes been influenced by, and real-life trans people haven't been presented fairly or accurately. We as a nation have a live and let live attitude, and it's to all of us that I hope to speak over the heads of anyone promoting extremes at one end of the argument or the other. The United Kingdom is in the midst of an epidemic of growing misogynistic violence towards anyone perceived as female. Boys have incel role models. We've had cases like the murder of Sarah Everard by a police officer using his police role as cover. We have serious issues to address, yet our government and our politicians on both sides of the house are bogged down with an obsession with sex and toilets. Inaction and failure leaves the statistics of violence against women and girls to worsen, and some attention to the economy might be a good idea as well. The Secretary of State for Justice has said that it's unacceptable to question judgments of our Supreme Court. Well, if we do it respectfully, I disagree. Lawyers and journalists do that all the time, as do judges sometimes. Ordinary people down the pub do it. It is our right to do it. We must respect our judges and our courts, but discussion isn't disrespect. No court should be democratically unaccountable by way of public discussion. I also heard yesterday that a spokesperson for the gender critical ideology movement, flushed with success on matters laboratorial, said that if a challenge to the European Court of Human Rights failed, then the position which the UK is in the UK could be spread across the whole of Europe, and they welcomed that. So since yesterday, this engages with the human rights and privacy of all EU citizens and the institutions which serve to protect them, such as parliaments and data protection commissions. They must sit up and look. The gender critical ideology movement has chosen to widen this now to vast numbers of non-UK people. That was their choice. I hope what I say will be translated into EU languages and distributed widely to organisations and people in the EU, and I would welcome that. So what's happened? What do we need to know now? Well, 20 years ago, the United Kingdom passed the Gender Recognition Act because the UK was infringing the human rights of people who had undergone or were undergoing what at the time we might have called a sex change, something like that. Now we call it gender reassignment. The court which made that decision against the UK was the European Court of Human Rights, which, like the Eurovision Song Contest, has nothing to do with the EU, but covers a much wider range, including Ukraine, Turkey, and others. The song which the court sings, rather than being a wonderful, joyous celebration of the diversity of life at Eurovision, is about ensuring that countries don't abuse the reasonable freedoms of their citizens. Our country helped to shape that court as a result of the Second World War, in which my father served. It ruled against the UK because it didn't legally recognise the right to a change of sex. They considered areas like pensions, employment, marriage, and so on. And in a previous case, it had already been decided that the rape of a trans woman with a surgically created vagina was the rape of a woman. You'll have noticed I used the word sex. That's the word used by the court in its legal summary in the European Court of Human Rights. So as a result, Parliament passed the Gender Recognition Act. It was fully debated, objections were heard, it was passed democratically with the backing of both sides of the political spectrum. That Act of Parliament says that if you follow a court and medical process, your new sex will be recognised legally for all purposes. You have your birth re-registered under your new sex and you receive a new birth certificate that looks just like anyone else's. Mine says female. And if my vagina could speak, it would say the same. So let's look at April 2025. The Supreme Court decided that even though my sex was changed about 20 years ago, supposedly for all purposes, it didn't, after all, change my sex for equality law. Yet the government at the time of presenting the 2004 Act of Parliament even said it included discrimination law. Sex is now biological sex, which has no generally accepted legal or medical definition. Courts have to follow human rights law when interpreting acts of Parliament. So if a court thinks that one meaning would be an infringement of human rights, then it's not likely to decide that Parliament ever intended it to mean that. I applied to be a party to the Supreme Court case of 4 Women in Scotland, backed by the Good Law Project, along with a trans man. The court refused to allow trans people to put in evidence reflecting the impact of potential interpretations of the Act on the trans community. They refused without reasons. That, with genuine respect to them, hobbled their ability to explore the human rights implications and alternative interpretations of the Act. We were not heard. The Supreme Court did not consider the human rights consequences of its choice of interpretation for all UK citizens, not just people like me, or all people visiting the UK or working or living here, including for the EU, and some of those people's sex will now change, believe it or not, instantly when the aeroplane wheels land at Heathrow. Human rights aren't just words, they're rights which have to be protected in real and effective ways. To put it another way, the court did not hear important evidence and argument about the real impacts on our community of the interpretations of the Act. The government has now announced policy, very sadly, that trans women should now use men's spaces regardless of anatomy. Trans men should use women's spaces. The safety risks are obvious and urgent, and they affect us all now. Lesbian women already get at least as much trans-related abuse as we do, and possibly more. If they're not a stereotypical feminine appearance, then they will get more now if they use female spaces, because they will be challenged as to their biological sex. The live and let live attitude, which is so British, seems to be fading. People of non-white Western origin who may not conform to Western feminine stereotypes will be challenged too. Likewise, they can't prove their sex. None of us can, now that birth certificates don't mean anything. Remember, mine is female, and so is that of a woman registered as female at birth. Children in a marriage where the person they call mum is trans will now face the degrading and possibly frightening experience of having to be taken to the men's loos, thanks to government policy, because mum now should use the men's loos. There's often no third option. Some say, use the disabled toilet. Well, nobody asked disabled people, did they? They have particular needs, and yet it seems to be thought that it's just fine for trans people to move in on them. Many of us object. I expect many of the disabled community do as well. The privacy implications are enormous. Employers will have to ask your biological sex and compare that with what you look like, or what you say you are. Shops will have to ask so they can decide which toilet you can use. The enforcement agency in the UK can bring cases if they don't, or private individuals or campaign groups will, in the glare of publicity. But more than that, though, the safety of all women is at stake. Male police officers, believe it or not, are now strip searching people with female genitalia. If they're thought to be trans, people can't tell your biological sex, whatever that might mean. Any woman now may be asked, now if she's thought to be trans, perhaps because she's a masculine appearing lesbian, then she is at risk of strip search by a man. What an opening for another Wayne Couzens to get access to a female victim. I now want to read to you a letter which I've had from Transgender Europe, which represents over 200 LGBTQ organizations in Europe and Central Asia, which operates at EU and United Nations levels. You can remember, I hope, that the gender critical ideology movement yesterday explained its position to state that it welcomed the possibility that all of this would now affect the whole of Europe. TGEU, I hope, are vital allies, given the effort now to spread a gender critical ideology further. They gave me this statement to read to you to mark Transgender History Week. Transgender Europe condemns this judgment as the court has interpreted the protected characteristic of sex and the word woman in the UK's Equality Act, the anti-discrimination law, to mean biological sex and biological woman. We stand in unwavering solidarity with trans people in the UK and every trans person impacted by this ruling. The court has effectively undone 20 years of struggles for equality protections for trans people based on a highly technical interpretive exercise. Legal gender recognition under the UK Gender Recognition Act should lead to the full recognition of a person on par with other members of the same gender in all areas of life. It's important to recall the context in which the UK's Gender Recognition Act was passed. It was enacted following the European Court of Human Rights decision in Christine Goodwin in the UK, which found that trans people's rights to private life, Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, was violated due to a lack of gender recognition procedures. The UK's Supreme Court decision has severely undermined legal certainty and reinforced the structural inequality of a community that already faces unprecedented levels of exclusion from basic services. TGEU Executive Director Emania Brown said, TGEU affirms that trans women are women and trans men are men. Any legal framework that refuses to recognise this puts all women at risk, especially women who are gender non-conforming, Black and brown women and disabled women. We emphasise that the rights of trans people are inseparable from women's rights and are intertwined in the shared struggle for bodily autonomy, safety and justice. This judgment departs from a long time established European human rights consensus and is in stark contrast with the European Court of Human Rights interpretation of the right to protection of private life for trans people. It is time for robust anti-discrimination legislation in the UK and in Europe that protects trans people's access to public goods and services on the basis of sex and on the basis of their gender identity. TGEU stands steadfastly with membership in the UK and wider trans community in the UK in navigating a vastly changed landscape on anti-discrimination. So, to you all, what I say with a conciliatory heart, I hope, and with reasonableness, is that I trust the UK can now return to the tolerant way that things worked a few years ago. I hope the real reasonable people of the UK and its politicians will hear this, and I hope the government will hear this. But if matters don't return to a tolerance reflecting our national values, then the determination of the LGBTQ community, and now I believe the whole EU LGBTQ community, has an unwavering resolution that we will not let this stand, and that by legal means in court, we will regain and protect our rights, freedoms, and obligations. A trans man I'll call James messaged me today. He said, I'm connecting with you to show support as I now live in fear of an uncertain future. He speaks for us all. Thank you.